The government will take over up to 2/3 of Eskom's unsustainable 400 billion rand debt and 70% of Gauteng's e-toll debt. Now, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana said all of this during the midterm budget policy statement in Parliament yesterday. Transnet and Denel will also receive a 2.9 billion and 3 billion respectively. Meanwhile, growth has been revised downwards to 1.9% in 2022 from a previous 2.1% estimated in February. Political parties said that this budget policy statement came short of expectations, while many South Africans have also registered their disappointment that no announcement was made of a reprieve on fuel costs, the cost of food, countering inflation, and of course the general escalating cost of living. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana joins us now virtually for a further discussion. Minister, good morning and thanks so much for being with us here on Morning Live.
Good morning. Yes.
So,
good morning.
Minister, this was always going to be a very tough balancing act, and you did mention what you called a long-standing structural impediments that were hampering growth, and these would include the unreliable supply of electricity in the country, costly and inefficient ports and rail networks, crime, corruption, weak state capacity, and all of those. But none of these were actually new. And I'm curious to understand what will actually change from yesterday to address all of these structural impediments.
Thank you. Let me just start by correcting something. You said we're going to take up to 32% of Eskom debt. The formulation I used was between 1/3 and 2/3.
Yes.
So we're working the numbers. I'll correct that. The second thing is we're highlighting those things up front to say people, there's a tendency to think that macroeconomic policy is kind of a panacea, when in fact there are a lot of structural impediments to the economy. It does not, those issues are being attended as we speak. For instance, there's government is working on the electricity sector. There's been a cabinet committee working with that chaired by the president himself. So that is getting attention. We're putting resources, for instance, on the crime situation, where as we speak, the 10,000 police that are being recruited by the Department of Police, over the next 3 years, we'll be adding another 15,000 police to the system, which will boost the number of police and help deal with the crime situation.
So many would argue, Minister, that the answer perhaps is not throwing more money at these challenges, because the challenges which have resulted in the failure to change the face of poverty and inequality in South Africa are all in the purview of the state. And you mentioned yesterday the weak state, the weak capacity of the state. But why is the state weak? You know, in terms of addressing all of these issues, you sit in cabinet with your cabinet colleagues who are responsible for various portfolios to address these matters. How do those conversations go?
As I said, the president just addressed the nation in terms of the Zondo report. The Zondo report reflects deeply on some of the structural constraints on what has happened to the state, to weaken the state over the past few years. And government is attempted to react to that. The president's statement to a submission to Parliament is a collective effort by cabinet as to say, how do we react, respond to those issues? In fact, each cabinet member has got a list of things to address, to resolve, to respond to those state capture issues which actually undermine the capacity of government.
And you're absolutely correct, Minister. And in light of, South Africa having spent over R1 billion on that commission, one would imagine that we want to see some sort of action taken in terms of the recommendations. But We knew a lot of this even before the Zonda Commission report was released. You look at the SOEs, you look at the challenges, and many would argue that those challenges don't necessarily start and end with money, because there are issues with regard to leadership, there are issues with regard to competence, there are governance issues. There's little to no accountability in certain instances. And yes, while we are now seeing some prosecutions and talk of this over the years, we continue to see looting of state-owned enterprises. So how do we hold people accountable so that we don't just keep spending money and not seeing any real tangible changes?
Let me start by saying what we are discussing today is the medium-term budget policy statement. What is this? What is the Minister of Finance's role? The Minister of Finance's role is to ensure that resources are available for those institutions. Then there's the next step, which probably is not the discussion for today. For instance, if we want to what is happening with the prosecution authorities, our duty is to make sure that they've got the resources to carry through their task. Then the second stage is that my colleague in justice is going to make sure that there's, in fact, they carry through their functions properly. So that's highlighting what we're discussing today is the budget. There will be a whole range, I've indicated to you, a whole range of functions colleagues have got to do to give effect to make sure that capacity is there.
And it's a fair point, Minister, but to a point, because there has to be accountability. For example, we cannot build a house today and have to pay again to build the same house next year and the following year. There has to be accountability in terms of how the money is spent.
Let me just say, if you watch carefully and read the speech carefully, I make that point throughout the speech that when we give these funds to our votes to relevant programs, we are going to require value for money. That's what we can do from our side. But the actually carrying out, you'll see that the actually supervision belongs elsewhere.
And I like when you say you're going to require value for money. How are you going to do that, Minister?
For instance, let me just take where I've been explicit. I'm saying, for instance, when you take over Eskom's debt, before we can take the debt, there are conditions precedent which Eskom will have to meet to satisfy that if we transfer the give and take the debt, Eskom will get efficiency gains and operational efficiency. So those are the things we're putting across.
And we look at Eskom, and of course, some are in agreement, some saying it's not a good idea, excuse me, Minister, and that government is perhaps going the wrong way in taking over Eskom debt. There are those two schools of thought.
Let me just explain this matter. You know, no one wants to bail an institution for the sake of doing it. You know, the three things, our exposure to Eskom is such that if we don't intervene and Eskom defaults, they will take the sovereign with them. So we're between a rock and hard place. If we don't do it, Eskom may default and drag the sovereign with it. So it's in the interest of the state to begin to intervene, but impose and make sure that there are efficiency gains. We are not going to get back into the same position in the future.
And that, of course, is the one position. The other position, Minister, contends that by taking over that Eskom debt and putting it on the national balance sheet, by so doing, you are equally blowing up the sovereign debt that is already out of control. Some would say it brings about an unsustainable fiscal position. So with all of that debt, 4.7 trillion rand, our expected growth at around an average of 1.6% revised downwards now. People are asking, so how is this going to support our developmental goals, one? And how is the government planning to expand its revenue base?
Public finances, when you manage them, is about trade-offs. There are no easy answers. We're making choices. And you make those choices, you say, in the current environment, what is the best choice for public finances? So there's no doubt that taking part of Eskom will bump up the ratios where there's debt to GDP ratio, the deficit, or so on. There's no doubt that we will do that. The question we must ask is the other side of the coin. If we don't do it and Eskom defaults, what are the implications for the same fiscus? So that's why I'm saying that these choices are not easy. Not easy decisions. It's quite easy when you are sitting outside to say, it's like a spectator watching players play and criticize how they are playing. These are hard choices. The second thing, revenue, I agree. The first thing, most of the thing we've got to do is to grow this economy. We made 3 points there on the infrastructure, on the investment. We said the first thing, a private sector which does 2/3 of the investment in this country, we've got to make sure that we create the necessary investment environment that they invest. Secondly, we've got to use the infrastructure of government to crowd them in. The next thing, we're strengthening the balance sheet of our state-owned enterprises, which have weak investment in order to invest. Thirdly, we're putting a lot of resources as government into social infrastructure. All of that, we hope it will crowd in investment and grow the economy and assist us in getting the revenues we require.
And then, of course, there are all the bailouts for various state-owned enterprises, Minister. 23.7 billion for Sanral, 5.8 billion for Transnet, 204.7 million for Denel, and so on. You read those numbers and it actually is astronomical. Why are these entities allowed to fail? And yes, we can talk about the Zondo Commission report and how some of these institutions have been hollowed out, but has the trajectory changed? Are we doing anything different at this stage to make sure that we do not repeat those mistakes that have landed us here?
Let me go back. I've been arguing this point this morning with you, that in each of these instances, there are conditions precedent which will say we're not going to go back into the same situation. So we are putting conditions, but in the case, Sanral is in a different set completely, because Sanral was before 2010, Sanral did an improvement in order in preparation for 2010. And those improvements, they were supposed to have been funded by ETO. Politicians across the spectrum, not only one party, politicians and NGOs across the spectrum killed Sanral. Not Sanral's fault. Killed Sanral by mobilizing people not to pay ETO. In that sense, it's not Sanral's fault. So we're making the intervention in order to help Sanral given this problem.
So with regard to Denel, for example, if you look at what's going to happen there, as part of that money is to reduce the contingent liabilities arising from their weak financial position. And we know how difficult things have been at Denel, people not getting paid. You look at another entity like the South African Post Office, for example, where it's reported that at this point, people are not even receiving their pensions. And these are really terrible situations, and worse so for the employees, Minister, when these entities fail to actually do what they are supposed to in terms of taking care of people's monies to make sure that when you retire, your payout is actually there as it should be guaranteed. How are you intervening in that instance to make sure that when a state entity fails, people are not left worse off?
Let me start with Denel. You know, my view, if an institution cannot perform and cannot sustain, there's no reason for government to continue to fund it. But we must ask the question, what is the strategic nature of that institution? In the case of Denel, Denel is quite critical for the equipping the South African national defense. We can't, if Denel dies, the defense force will rely on imports, which is not necessary in our national interests. In this regard, the management of Denel have satisfied us before we could make this thing that the turnaround strategy is going to work. And as a result, they've got a 12 billion order book as we sit. Part of the difficulty is a cash flow to be able to execute that order book. Secondly, is a weak balance sheet which is undermining their capability to go to the market. So we're correcting those things for Denel. We're clear in our intervention in Denel is going to be effective moving forward. The post office, we're going to come back to it. The question is, we've got to evaluate whether the post office in its present form needs to exist in its present form. Mind you, the post office used to be sending letters, parcels and so on. That market now has got private operators, has got everybody else. The question is, what is going to be the new role? We are meeting with the Minister of Communication and Digital Technologies next week to look deeply into the post office issue.
So when you talk about turnaround strategies, Minister, we've seen previously at state-owned entities where turnaround strategies have been presented, and numerous ones. You take SAA, for example, there were probably more than 10. Nothing helped. It didn't turn around the situation. So what happens when those turnaround strategies actually do not yield the required results?
I would imagine that's precisely the reason a government decided to dispose of SAA.
So at what stage then do you decide to do that? At the first, second, third turnaround strategy failure, or 10 strategies down the line?
There are two issues. The question is, can the institution be turned around? Secondly, how strategic is it in the economy? Those considerations are quite important in guiding the decision we make. For instance, if I'll just outline the strategic importance of Denel. Transnet is critical for our logistics in the current environment. Transnet is a major player, also a monopoly. Even if we had to introduce private participation in both in rail and ports, it can't replace Transnet in the current environment. So you've got to, then if you don't intervene, you're talking the economy.
Minister, what's your response to the public's disappointment that nothing was said about assisting the public regarding the high cost of fuel, the cost of food, and something to essentially, in the short to medium term, counter inflation?
There are two issues to that. It is precisely for the same reason why government has agreed to extend. Mind you, we said the SRD grant of 250 is going to come to an end in March 2023. Precisely for the same reason you're talking about, government has decided to extend it for a further year. Secondly, if we look at the price of petrol, from April to August, government has been assisting the consumer from April to August. But since then, we've seen the price of petrol going down, and we're observing that process, and therefore we'll make the appropriate reaction at some point.
And the price of diesel, though, and you're correct about the price of petrol, but the price of diesel, and that is seemingly where the knock-on effect happens for people, because if you look at how goods are transported, those vehicles use diesel, Eskom uses diesel, all of those sectors. And is there a plan at the moment with regard to the diesel price and trying to intervene there, Minister?
No, I don't want to mislead you and the public. I've gotten no plan and no request on my table on those issues. So they're not even on my agenda. It's not that they should not be, but I'll be guided by my colleagues from Energy.
And then, of course, in an earlier interview this morning, Leanne spoke to Professor Bonang Mohale, and one of the things he said with regard to the grants is that we will see the ANC do this because, and of course, appreciating the separation of party and state, but saying that given that we are going into elections, the ANC's own election in December, and of course towards the 2024 elections, we will see these sort of concessions being made so that you don't necessarily incur the wrath of the electorate. What's your response to that?
My response is that I'm more preoccupied with how we can assist the economy to grow. I don't think anybody, a young person, wants for his future to be determined by a 350. That doesn't work. I don't think it's in the interest of the ANC as well to say these young people must remain on 350 a month for their lives. The ANC's intention must be how to make sure that those young people get into productive activity and have a future. So that's the first point. So it's quite critical to grow the economy. The second point that was preoccupying us is how these basic services are being provided. You see, that's the focus what we're doing with the budget, providing education, funding education, healthcare, police, water, roads. So that's those in themselves have made earlier point up when I was talking about investment that we intentions to crowd out that investment. That's broad strategic thrust. The grant is a temporary intervention. It may well be, I'm not denying that it may be increased beyond 2024. In fact, you will see in the numbers, we've penciled it for that grant for the medium term until a replacement is found.
Minister, you also spoke about the possibility of energy rationing in Europe. And this, of course, will have a global knock-on effect. Already in South Africa, we are facing an energy crisis, be it in the fuel sector due to the refinery situation, energy as in electricity. So how is government planning to mitigate what is likely to basically rub off from what's happening geopolitically around the world?
There are two aspects to that question. The first one is on general fuel, not electricity, fuel. I think it'd be incorrect for me. I know Minister Mantashe is seized with that question. I think it's better placed to be in a position to explain whatever strategy, including emergency measures, is intending to do. The second aspect of your question is the economic impact of that rationing. Clearly, a slowdown in Europe, South Africa's economy is one of the most integrated into the global economy on the African continent. You will remember during the global financial crisis, we're the only country on the African continent that lost about 2 million jobs. It reflects that kind of integrated embeddedness and integration into the global economy. So impacts on, though we're watching those things with interest, we're just come up from the World Bank and IMF meeting, and a number of countries were expressing kind of worries about such an outcome.
Well, Minister, we are out of time, but we do thank you for speaking to us here on Morning Live today. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana speaking to us, dissecting some of the items in the midterm budget policy statement, which he delivered in Parliament yesterday.